So before we get into that, I actually want to bring it back and talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or Maslow's motivational model, right? And the reason I want to talk about this, and most people have seen it, and like it's not like I don't think it's the be all and end all of a model that teaches you how to work in the world or navigate the world, but it does lay some sort of foundational thinking for how you should potentially think about your health management, right? And if you've seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's a pyramid, right? At the base of that pyramid, we've got psychological, or sorry, I could say physiological needs, right? And that's kind of covered by the stuff that we're talking about when we're talking about health, when we're talking about diet, training, sleep, all those kind of things. A lot of those fall into the realms of like physiological needs. Now, some of the physiological needs, they are much more deep than that, like oxygen, like you need air, like it's a physiological need. Like as a human, you need air, right? And again, you'll see this if you ever fucking have nearly drowned, you'll see how ingrained that motivation and that hierarchy of needs, how much of a baseline need that is, because everything else shuts down for your body. No, you're not thinking, you're completely present, you're in the moment when you're drowning, because all that matters to you as an organism is get the fuck out of the water, right? Get some air into your lungs, right? So there are obviously more important needs than others. And this again starts this thought process of there's clearly a hierarchy of needs here. Some of them are really foundational, and some of them are, still foundational, but less important, right? And there are also other things in this pyramid. There's safety needs, right? And again, I think most people would be aware of what these are in terms of, you want to live in an environment where you're not getting shot at, you're not, in Afghanistan or anything like that. Like you need to be safe, your house is not getting bombed, et cetera, right? But there's also, again, gradations within that, because you could live in a, say for example, a Western world, but you don't feel like you're in a safe environment. There's a lot of robbery or violent crime in your area, right? Or potentially the people that you hang around with are just not good people, or I don't know, you're in an abusive relationship or whatever, like you don't feel safe. So again, gradations within that. The next thing that's on that hierarchy of needs, or that motivational model, is your needs for belonging and love, right? And again, this is often stuff that we just go, oh yeah, like we assume that's looked after, right? But oftentimes it's not. And it's really apparent, again, because I live in London, talk to different people. Like a lot of people will be, working from home, for example, and they basically don't talk to anyone else apart from their work colleagues all day, right? And maybe they go to the gym, and they're in a position where they don't really feel a sense of belonging, right? And they don't really feel love, because they're on their own. Yeah, all they do is work. Maybe they fucking play PlayStation in the evening or whatever, but they're not integrated into their society. They don't feel that sense of belonging. They don't feel that sense of love. Like we've kind of talked about this before, but generally speaking, two is the fundamental unit of humans, right? Like a single human on their own doesn't really work all that well, right? Like, yeah, we can survive on our own, but it seems to be that you need at least two humans to actually feel like a complete human, right? Now, the Greeks had an idea about this where, the gods basically had split our soul in two, and, you were kind of destined to wander the earth until you found your counterpart, the other half of your soul, right? That's effectively where in the West we got that idea of soulmates from, where it's like it comes from that Greek mythology. And again, that's probably influenced by Persian mythology as well, because Greek and Persian mythology, they often intertwine. We don't necessarily always acknowledge that, but they do often quite intertwine. So it probably comes from that. It might even be a Proto-Indo-European belief. But either way, we have this belief that you have a soulmate, you have another half to your soul. And it kind of speaks to this topic of two is the fundamental unit of humans, right? So you need two. I don't care if it's a guy and a guy, a guy and a girl and a girl, whatever the fuck, it actually doesn't matter. It just seems that two is the unit, right? And then our next one on this motivational hierarchy is esteem needs, like self-esteem, we might call it. And we'll touch on that a little bit later on as well. And then after that, we kind of move into Growth needs, right? All those ones we've talked about are deficiency needs, right? Like you need to have these or you will feel deficient, right? After that, we move into the growth needs, which are stuff that we need to actually do to actually, push forward in society, push forward as a society, become the best human that we can possibly become, right? And there's a quote, I actually don't know where I read it before, but it's kind of like when we're talking about self-actualization, which is the top of the pyramid, there is a quote, and I've said it to you before, Gary, where it's like, hell is to meet the person you could have been at death and to realize you are not even in his shadow, right? Like there's clearly a best version of you, right, that you could become. And you kind of want to be working towards that. Like you don't want to, again, meet this person on your deathbed and realize that you are literally a minuscule percentage of that person. Like you did not reach your potential, right? And this is why we focus a lot on getting the deficiency needs ticked off, because if we don't get those ticked off, you're never going to be able to actually transcend. You're never going to be able to self-actualize, right? So anyway, getting into that a little bit deeper, we have cognitive needs. And again, cognitive, you kind of know what they're talking about there. Like, are you being mentally stimulated? Are you actually thinking beyond just the, like, I know basic maths and I know how to speak English? It's like, what's your brain built for? Have you maximized that? Are you challenging yourself? Are you expanding your scope of cognitive development, right? Aesthetic needs, and again, these are environmental, personal, the whole shebang, right? Humans like a certain look, right? There's no two ways about it, and we want to kind of aspire towards that. And then once we've done that, we get into this kind of self-actualization, which is becoming your best self. And then we get into this kind of transcendence, which is not just maximizing the individual, it's going beyond the individual, right? Like, what are you doing to advance humanity? What are you doing to advance, society as a whole? What are you doing to advance your community? What are you doing to advance your family? Like we can look at that transcendence from multiple levels, right? Before I move back to just talking about those physiological needs, do you have anything to say on that kind of hierarchy of needs, that model?
Yeah, just some kind of overarching notes. Like one would be that when it was initially introduced, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people kind of interpreted it as, that you needed to finish one step before you moved on to the next. And to some degree, that is true in a sense that, like, if you're totally hypoxic, to use your example previously, clearly anything else is not going to be important, or you're not going to be able to move on to it. However, the reality is that for the most part, you just need to mostly satisfy the need below before moving on to the one above. Okay, it needs to be mostly satisfied, but it doesn't need to be 100%. An easy example of that would be, if you're in total starvation, there's war in your country and there's a famine and everything, clearly that's going to be your most pressing need. You're going to be doing everything you can to seek food, and nothing else is going to gain your attention. However, if you're in a mild calorie deficit, like a lot of our listeners, you're still technically at a deficiency of nutrition to some degree, but you're still able to maintain attention on higher order needs such as safety, love and belonging, etc. And what's interesting there is that you can even see that, like, as bodybuilders get deeper and deeper into their deficits and deeper into stages of starvation, you can see how they're willing to accept larger trade-offs in some of the higher order needs. For example, belonging and love. They might actually sacrifice their relationships a bit because food seeking and their current state of starvation is actually their biggest priority, both psychologically and physiologically.
And
So
trend doesn't generally help with the whole, like, integrating into society.
that's true. That's true as well. Yeah, they didn't mention hormonal needs. Maybe that's in physiological. But yeah, and the other thing that you see here is the fact that an insult to one of your needs generally it produces a realization, but not for so long. An easy example of this would be, when someone experiences a loss, for example, in their family. Someone falls ill and suddenly they realize what really matters. Okay, but they've moved down towards the deficiency needs such as love and belonging. They realize the importance of that because there's been a dent the armor there. But 3 months down the line, you know, when the person is well again, they might stop calling to see that person as often. They're no longer occupying as many of their thoughts, and they're back to caring about the things that they previously used to, such as their personal career goals, maybe financial goals, etc. And that's normal. You know, that's a normal part of human life, that if something is intact, you're not going to be attending to it as much. So that's kind of just really important to understand those two separate things. The first being that you don't have to have 100% at any given level to care about the next one. And then the second one, that you might at certain points in your life move down in terms of the needs that you're tending to, if there's some sort of insult or injury to that need, while being able to kind of forget about it to some degree again in the future when it's intact again.
100%. And this also brings us to a kind of thought process here where like these needs are kind of like baseline requirements, right? And as we said, there's kind of gradations within those, right? And again, I like the idea of a pyramid because it's a nice metaphor or analogy in terms of it actually allows you to think, okay, well, if I build a sturdier base, that means that the higher order things, or the things that are higher up on this kind of hierarchy, like they can actually be sturdier. They can actually be more fully actualized, I suppose you might say, right? And this is interesting to kind of think about because we don't need to build an extremely sturdy base to be able to build a very tall building, right? Like, yeah, the sturdier the base, the better, right? But if we're talking about the kind of health needs here that we're going to be moving on to in a second, you don't need to be 100% perfect. However, you have to be willing to understand that there is a little bit of a trade-off here as well, right? Like a lot of people, they're kind of aiming towards this self-actualization. They're trying to be the best they can be in their career, for example, or as a family person, or, you know, whatever it is that like self-actualization means for them, but they're not actually looking after themselves, right? Like they're not actually fulfilling their physiological needs. They're on this kind of, okay, I've just barely ticked the box with physiological needs. We have a, you know, energetic requirement, you know, we don't photosynthesize or whatever, right? So we have an energetic requirement, which means you have to eat food. And yeah, you can tick the box with eating food and go, yeah, I've eaten enough calories, but that doesn't mean that that physiological needs box is 100% ticked, right? And a lot of people are trying to achieve self-actualization or this kind of transcendence, and they haven't had a good night's sleep in 2 years. They haven't had a good high quality meal in the last month, like they haven't drank enough water in the last couple of days. So while there is this kind of, okay, you don't need to 100% have this, physiological needs or whatever else ticked off, there are still gradations within that. And the sturdier you build your base, the better, to an extent, right?